Chapter 14. They headed westward, stopping to camp as they went, catching fresh fish so as to keep their supply of smoked fish for later. Gunnhild felt at home on the water now, and the motions of sailing came easily to her. She always stayed within sight of land, however. Sometimes she passed islands that marked the edge of the Wadden Sea, but she always kept to the left of them, seeing no reason to sail into the North Sea. For now they only needed to follow the coastline, though she knew that must change eventually. The water jugs worked well enough, as Eadyth had predicted. The pottery did absorb some of the water, and the jugs darkened and were moist to the touch when they were full. Nevertheless, they held up, and the girls were able to keep at least a week's supply of fresh water at hand. They saw a house on the second day, and then houses and farms became more frequent as they continued. There were only a few, but after weeks of not seeing another person, the farms came as a surprise. Gunnhild steered the boat well away from them, but the knowledge that they were now near human habitation weighed on her. Part of her wanted to go meet other people, but far away from Denmark as she was, they would not be her people. Then, on the 5th day sailing west, the mast broke. Gunnhild was tacking, sailing at a zigzag to the wind, and as she turned the boat to angle back the other way, there was a groaning noise, and the mast snapped and fell. The sail and all the ropes came down with it, and the tangled mess bobbed on top of the water. Gunnhild swore, then swore again, and stamped her foot on the bottom of the boat. "We can repair it," said Eadyth optimistically. "Not without tools," said Gunnhild. "We'll need a brand new mast. We could do it if we had tools, but—" She left the rest unsaid. The mast had broken near the base, though it was still partially attached, and the sail now dragged in the water, making it almost impossible to row. Gunnhild pulled the broken base of the mast free from the slot that held it, then started untying the ropes so that the mast and the sail could be dragged onto the boat. She took apart the yard, the pole that ran across the top of the mast, so that everything could be bundled up. The whole time she muttered furiously under her breath. Eadyth didn't know what to do, and didn't want to get in the way. When the mast, yard, and the bunched-up sail were all sitting tied up across the boat, the two girls took their places at the oars. "Are we rowing for shore?" asked Eadyth. "I was going to," said Gunnhild, "but then I realized there's nothing we can do on shore. We can't fix the mast there. We might as well keep rowing." "Do you think we can row all the way to England?" asked Eadyth. "I don't know, do I?" snapped Gunnhild. "I didn't even know what I was doing before the stupid mast broke." They continued to row until Gunnhild's shoulders knotted up, and she pushed away the oars in frustration. Eadyth hadn't spoken, but when Gunnhild stopped, she stopped too. Even with practice, she was not a skilled rower, and she wasn't quite big enough to fit the boat yet. She was only 12, and a year of work on Gunnhild's family farm had made her more scrawny than muscular. They sat still, listening to the wind, and felt the boat rocking gently beneath them. Then Eadyth raised her head and looked around, and squinted at the horizon. "Do you hear something?" she asked. Gunnhild tilted her head, raising an ear to the distance. "What am I listening for?" she asked. "Tapping," said Eadyth. "Like metal." Gunnhild continued to listen, but couldn't hear anything. "Wait for the wind to calm," said Eadyth. "It's coming from ahead." She pointed to a distant shore further to the west. Gunnhild waited, and then suddenly heard it. A faint tink, tink, tink sound, barely audible over the roar of the sea. "What do you think it is?" asked Eadyth. "I don't know," said Gunnhild, "but if it's a person making the sound, then at least it might be someone who can help fix the mast. Should we go find out?" Eadyth looked apprehensive. "It's that, or we row across the North Sea with no sail. We're going to have to meet people eventually." "I know," said Eadyth. "Let's go." As they continued rowing, the sound grew louder, but stopped from time to time. Gunnhild was about to point out that she couldn't see where the sound might be coming from when Eadyth stood halfway up in the boat and cupped her hands around her eyes to see better. "It's some buildings, houses," she said. The shoreline ahead of them was low and flat, without many trees. The houses were barely visible in the distance. They kept rowing, but Eadyth kept turning around to look at their destination. Eventually she stopped rowing, and Gunnhild kept them moving forward as Eadyth continued to stare. "What do you see?" asked Gunnhild. "Buildings. It's a village." "Oh," said Gunnhild, understanding. "It's the blacksmith making that noise." I think there's a church, said Eadyth, squinting into the distance. How do you know? Asked Gunnhild. It looks like one, said Eadyth. It's not big, but it looks different than a house. So what does that mean? Asked Gunnhild. Is that a good thing? It must be, said Eadyth. I wonder who they are. Half an hour later they had reached the village. It wasn't right on the beach. The houses didn't start until the sand and beach grass had given way to packed dirt and small trees. Gunnhild could see thatched houses, similar to her own house in Denmark, and a wooden church. She also saw 2 men in the distance who seemed to be walking toward them. Let's pull up here, suggested Gunnhild. They ran aground, got out, and pushed the boat up the beach past the high tide line, and looked up to see 2 men getting nearer. Both had beards and long hair. They wore undyed woolen tunics and belts. Gunnhild noticed they didn't have swords, and was silently grateful. Yalla! Hwa sind ye? Shouted one of the men as he approached. Eadyth had been standing behind Gunnhild, but when she heard his words her demeanor changed. Her eyes grew wide with excitement, and she ran forward. Spreketh ye English? She asked. Is this England? One of the men called back at her. Nay, this is Friesland. Von where cometh ye? Eadyth was about to respond, but stopped. She hurried back to Gunnhild and spoke in a low voice. Listen, you have to trust me, said Eadyth. About what? Said Gunnhild. Shh, said Eadyth. Don't speak. Don't speak at all. I'll explain later. Gunnhild was about to ask why, but caught herself. Eadyth had already turned back toward the men. Wit sent English's focus, she yelled, and ran to them before Gunnhild could catch up. Father Wilfrith sat at his table, his head bowed in prayer. He wore long black robes tied about the waist with a simple rope. The top of his head was shaved, leaving a ring of black hair flecked with gray. He rested his forehead on his clasped hands, eyes closed. He had been sitting for a while, but it was hard for him to concentrate. Every time he turned his mind toward the Lord and his works, some part of him pointed out that he was just trying to avoid what lay ahead of him. He raised his head and sighed. I've already prayed about it, he thought. Now I just have to do it. He stood and looked around his small one-room house. He thought of a few jobs he had meant to do, a letter he had planned to write, but he had to admit that he was stalling again, and instead got ready to leave his house and go and find Minhard. It was never easy talking to Minhard. As he opened his door and looked out past the church, he saw 2 men of the village, Oswig and Beoman, approaching, and they had other people with them, 2 girls from the look of it. Good afternoon, Oswig, he said as they approached. Father Wilfrith, nodded Oswig. We found these 2 on the beach. They're English. Father Wilfrith took a moment to look over Gunnhild and Eadyth, who stood before him. They were a bit ragged, though Gunnhild's dress and the bronze pins that held it showed she wasn't poor. What were 2 English girls doing here? Good afternoon, Father, said Eadyth. My goodness, said the priest. You are English. From Northumbria, I take it? Yes, Father, said Eadyth. Gunnhild stood silently, looking around at the strangers and the surrounding village. What are your names? Wilfrith asked. I'm Eadyth, and this is my sister Gunnhild, said Eadyth. She doesn't speak, and she can hardly hear at all. You have to speak really slowly and gesture. Yes, I see, said Wilfrith, intrigued. How did you... Wait, you should come inside. Oswig, Beoman, thank you for bringing them to me. Wilfrith turned back inside, happy to have an excuse to put off the errand he had been about to go on, but aware it would still be waiting for him. This was the village of Winaam, a small collection of farms on the north coast of Frisia. Father Wilfrith had come here 8 years ago. It was well known that Charles, King of the Franks, valued English priests for their bravery and good Latin, and some of Wilfrith's brothers from the Abbey of St. Augustine had already gained positions in King Charles's expansive kingdom. Wilfrith had lived at the abbey for 20 years, safe within its walls, ever since he took holy orders as a young man, but as he passed his 40th year, he found he longed for something more, or at least something different. Long ago he had wanted to be an instrument of God's glory, but what good was he stuck in an abbey? It was time for an adventure, he had decided, a holy quest to spread the good word. So his abbot had written to the bishop, and the bishop had written to another bishop, and soon Wilfrith had been on his way to Frisia, a place, according to his brothers, that was not terribly civilized and only barely Christian. Now here he was, the only priest for 100 miles, and he had many souls in his care. He performed baptisms, marriages, and last rites, and said Mass on Sunday, but mostly he tried to guide his flock with wise counsel and words of encouragement. Some were more receptive than others. He had never been dissatisfied with his little village, but when the 2 English girls arrived at his door, he realized how much he missed home. Wilfrith brought them inside and provided them with a chair and a stool, the only ones he had, and gave them some bread, which they ate happily, while Eadyth told him the story she had been busy inventing. "My sister and I, we were fishing with my father. We lived near the mouth of the Humber, and a storm came in and blew us out to sea. My father was washed overboard." Eadyth paused to look sad. From the priest's expression, she saw her story was working. She just hoped Gunnhild didn't mess it up. "Our mast broke, and when the storm was over, we didn't know where we were or which way to sail. Right, Gunnhild?" she said, turning to her newly chosen sister. "Waves," she said loudly. "Big waves." She motioned with her hands, and Gunnhild nodded. Eadyth looked back at Wilfrith. "You poor, poor children," he said, shaking his head. "You are welcome here, and we will help you get home. The Lord is surely with you, and he has brought you here. Come," he said, standing up. "We must find someone for you to stay with. I know just the man." Eadyth and Gunnhild took in everything around them as Father Wilfrith escorted them through the village. It was not like Gunnhild's home, where the houses and farms were miles from any neighbors. Neither was it like Ripa, where the broad path to the pier was lined by merchants and craftsmen. Here there were thatched houses with outbuildings and gardens, mostly visible to each other, close enough to shout through a window at a neighbor. Beyond them were fields of grain and pastures of cattle. The small church with wooden walls and a shake roof stood near the center, and a large open patch of ground, worn with foot traffic over many years, served as the village green. Near one house she saw the blacksmith's forge that she had heard from the boat. Some people came out of the houses and began to ask Father Wilfrith about them. As she listened, Eadyth confirmed what she had realized when she met Oswig and Beomund on the beach. English and Frisian were so close that she could understand everyone without any trouble, and they could understand her. When the villagers talked to Father Wilfrith and he answered back, she noticed he changed his speech a little, and used a few words she didn't recognize, but it was easy to pick up the meaning. She marveled at her luck. The mast breaking was a disaster, but at least they had found some kind of people whom they could talk to. They arrived at a house, and Wilfrith called out to the people inside. It was a bigger house than most others in the village, and nicer too. Set back a bit from the village center, it sat next to 2 fields separated by fences, a barn, and a garden. The wooden doorway was carved in twisting designs, which Eadyth thought seemed extravagant for a farming family. 3 people emerged, and Wilfrith began introductions. "This is Theobald," said the priest, gesturing to a man in his 40s. "This is Oslag, his wife, and Gregory, their son." Gregory looked to be 17 or 18. He was tall and wiry, and his thick blonde hair was tied back to frame a kind face. "You are welcome here," Theobald told the girls. "They are English and good Christians," Wilfrith said, and began to retell Eadyth's story of their arrival here. "This one doesn't hear or speak," he said, indicating Gunnhild. He turned to Gunnhild. "What is her name again?" he asked. "Gunnhild," said Eadyth. "She understands a little if you speak loudly and clearly. She's always been like that." "Right, Gunnhild?" she said, emphasizing the English name and nodding at Gunnhild. Gunnhild nodded back, still trying to figure out where this charade was leading. "Come inside, girls," said Oslag. "You must be freezing out here with no coats to keep you warm." And she led them into the house and got them some food and blankets. Theobald and Gregory stayed outside and continued talking to Wilfrith. "Has Menhard changed his mind?" asked Theobald, changing the subject. "I haven't talked to him yet," said Wilfrith. "I was going there." "No one can deny his dog killed Eadolf's chicken. He owes compensation." Eadolf was Theobald's son-in-law. He had married Theobald's daughter Maria last year, and they lived in a smaller house with Eadolf's mother and sister. "He says the chicken was wandering the village free from its pen," said Wilfrith apologetically. "He says the dog can't be blamed." Theobald rolled his eyes and snorted at the absurdity of the idea. "He'll pay or he'll fight," said Theobald, "and Eadolf will be ready for him." "No, you see," said Wilfrith, shaking his hands as if to wave away a bad idea. They mustn't fight. Why would Jarl fight a duel over a chicken? It's not about the chicken, it's about the insult, said Thibault. Gregory stood to the side, arms crossed, taking in the conversation intently. The Lord said we must forgive those who do us harm, said Wilfrith. He commands us to be merciful. Thibault snorted again. I'm sorry, Father, he said. I love the Lord like all good Christians, but he would never ask us to ignore a slap in the face. Wilfrith found himself in an awkward position. Thibault had it completely wrong, but he had just done him a huge favor by taking in the two girls. Did Wilfrith want to start an argument with him now? He looked for a way out. I understand, my friend, said the priest, but the bishop has said that duels are pagan. He shrugged apologetically, then thanked Thibault and left. 2 generations ago, the Franks had crushed the Frisians in battle after battle and taken Frisia as their own. It took years to bring all of Frisia under control, but now King Charles was the undisputed ruler, and he had parceled the territory out to powerful counts and bishops who were able to collect taxes so long as they kept order. With the new ruler came a new religion, for King Charles was determined that his would be a Christian empire. The Frisians who lived in the village of Winaam were the grandchildren of those who were baptized at sword point. Some families had taken to the new ways happily, but some had never quite accepted them. The result was that the 2 most prominent families in the village had very different opinions of the Franks. Thibault was loyal to his king, though he had never met him, and loyal to the Count, Leodegar, who ruled here. He had given his children Christian names, Maria and Gregory. He was determined that Gregory would someday fight for the Count, and that his future grandchildren would learn to read and write in Latin. There was another family equal in stature to Thibault's, and the 2 were old rivals. Gerhard owned an impressive farm and a herd of healthy cattle. Like Thibault, he had servants to work his fields. Like Thibault, his house was large and well built. Gerhard's grandfather had been the village Guthi and had fought with King Redbod against the Franks. There was no village Guthi anymore, but Gerhard, his sister, and their cousin remembered the honor their family had once enjoyed. 15 years ago, when the Saxon warlord Widukind had led a revolt against the Franks, Gerhard and his brother-in-law had disappeared from the village for a year. It was an open secret that they had been fighting alongside the Saxons. Gerhard's brother-in-law had not returned, and Gerhard, Minhard, and their relatives continued to bear a grudge against the Franks and anyone allied with them, including the hapless English priest who had been sent to tend their village. Father Wilfrith approached Minhard, who sat on a stump near his fields. Minhard's dog lay by him, and it sat up when he saw Wilfrith. Minhard didn't look up. He was carving a stick of wood. Wilfrith couldn't tell what it might be useful for, and he continued even when the priest stopped in front of him. I think Jarl would accept an apology, said Wilfrith. It's really not about the chicken, you see. Maybe if you would simply say you were in the wrong, you wouldn't even need to pay him. Minhard continued carving, then looked up at Wilfrith. Wilfrith waited expectantly. No, said Minhard, and he went back to his carving. But why? Thibault and his family strut around here like they own the village, said Minhard. He paused. They don't own me. Pride is a grave sin, said Wilfrith. He meant it to sound stern, but wasn't very convincing. Minhard had a way of making him uneasy. He was a bit of a loner, and unmarried at 26. He spent all of his time with his dog, and might go for days without talking to anyone. When he did, though, he stuck to his family, Gerhard and the others. Minhard continued carving without looking up. There's all sorts of sins, I suppose, he said. Lying is, I know. And that chicken was running around the village, like I said. Redgar here, he nodded toward the dog, didn't break any fence. He paused. So I guess that's that. Wilfrith stood looking down at Minhard. I will pray for God to change your heart, he said, though it came out a bit more terse than he had intended. Good luck, Father, said Minhard. Wilfrith couldn't see, but was certain that Minhard smirked as he said it. Back at Thibault's house, Eadyth and Gunnhild were getting warm. They both were sipping broth wrapped in blankets. Aslag sat with them talking to Eadyth. Maria sat with her 1-year-old child, and 2 other children, a niece and nephew of Aslag's, had come to see the new arrivals too. A lazy dog was curled in a corner of the house, snoring occasionally. Eadyth worked at spinning a convincing story, while Gunnhild sat in silence. She understood almost nothing. The conversation grated on her. She hated not understanding, and having to trust Eadyth and whatever her plan was. She was grateful for the soup and the fire, but hoped they could get going again soon. Hours passed before Maria's child got cranky and Aslag ran out of questions. She had taken an instant liking to the girls and told them to call her Åsa, as the rest of the family did. She made up extra beds on the floor for Eadyth and Gunnhild, and then directed them to the latrine outside. Eadyth led Gunnhild to find it, and after walking at least 50 yards in silence, Eadyth looked around and whispered to Gunnhild in Danish. "Pretty good so far, I'd say." "What's going on?" whispered Gunnhild. "Why can't I talk?" "First off, this way we don't have to worry about keeping our stories straight. Second, this way they don't know you're Danish." "Why would that matter?" asked Gunnhild. "What if the Danes have attacked here too? What if the last time they heard Danish it was a band of warriors attacking the village?" Gunnhild stood in hurt silence. "Not only that, when I saw that church, I knew we would be better off if both of us were Christian. And so now you're English, and Christian, and my sister. Easier for everyone." When they returned from the latrine, they lay down on the furs and blankets. Gunnhild had almost forgotten what a real bed felt like, and now, in a warm house with hot food in her belly, she was tired beyond belief. She would have loved to relax and enjoy herself after weeks at sea, but it was hard not to feel bitter. She had never had to hide who she was before. She had never been a stranger. On the other side of the village, Gerhard and his family sat around the hearth. They had eaten and now sat in silence. Gerhard's wife, Hilke, sewed by the light of an oil lamp. She was his second wife. His first had died years ago from a sickness, leaving him with 2 sons, Oven and Sigurd. He looked at one and then the other and admired the men they had grown to be. Oven was an excellent farmer, and now he ran the farm more than his father did. He should marry, thought Gerhard. And Sigurd, almost 20 now. Fine, strong sons. Then his own children with Hilke, his daughter Luva, and his little son Helmig, who sat on the floor with a straw doll in each hand, enacting some scene between them. Hilke turned to her niece, Gislinda, for help threading a needle. Hilke's eyes weren't as sharp as they used to be, and Gislinda had been like a daughter since she had come to live with them. Her own father, Hilke's brother, had gone to Saxony with Gerhard, but never came back. Gerhard looked at her, almost 16, and his throat caught as he wished her father, his best friend, could have seen her growing up. By all expectations, Gerhard should be content. His farm was prosperous. He had hired workers. He never went hungry. He even had some silver coins in a box, should he ever need them. And yet there was a sense of foreboding about the hearth that night. Minhard had come to dinner and informed them about his conversation with the priest. If Eadolf pursued the case, more likely it would be that pompous troublemaker Thibault. Then there could be a duel, and while Gerhard would never back down from a fight, nor expect his cousin Minhard to, he knew it wouldn't end well. When he had gone to fight the Franks during the uprising, that was a real battle. 2 lines of warriors across a field from each other. He remembered that when he stood shoulder to shoulder with his friends, staring down the Frankish troops on horseback, he didn't feel an ounce of fear. His life was in the hands of God, or the gods, or whichever happened to be watching. Whatever the result of the battle, he would live or die, and then it would be over. But here in the village, one fight would lead to another, one family would turn against another, other families would get drawn in. It might never end. A feud could destroy the village, but he couldn't stop it any more than he could prevent a rainstorm. His only hope was that it would blow over. "Father," Sigurd said, "I've been wanting to ask you. The harvest is over now. The cattle have fodder for the winter. The pigs are slaughtered and salted. But the weather isn't too bad yet." "Yes," said Gerhard, leaning in. "I'd like to go to Dorstad," said Sigurd. Gerhard smiled. "Of course you would," he said, "and you wouldn't mind taking a coin or 2 with you, I bet. You're looking for a few days of drinking, maybe some gambling, some wrestling matches with the locals." He looked up at Hilke and winked. "You might even meet some girls. What do you say, Hilke? Should he go?" "Maybe send Oven to keep him out of trouble," Hilke said. Sigurd frowned. "Actually," he said, That's not quite what I was thinking. Do you remember when Count Leodegar passed through last spring? Gerhard's face darkened. He had no love for Leodegar, the Frankish count who had been given land reaching from Dorstad to the northern coast, including this village. Remember when he was talking to you, and he saw me and said I would make a fine warrior someday? Idle words, grumbled Gerhard. He was just playing the gracious aristocrat. That Frank doesn't think of us as anything more than peasants. Gerhard looked up at Seward and realized the effect his words had had. He tried to reverse course. Of course you would make an excellent warrior, Seward, he said. It's in your blood. You're strong and brave. But what does that have to do with Leodegar? He needs soldiers, and you taught me how to swing a sword as well as I can push a plow. Gerhard sighed. He's not your lord. Someday Charles will die. The Franks will crumble. Frisia will be free. That's why I taught you how to swing a sword. Seward looked hurt. Remember when those traders came through before the harvest? He asked. They said King Charles needed men to fight in Spain and Italy. I want to go with them. Gerhard pursed his lips and breathed deeply. You want to fight for Charles? I want to fight for someone, said Seward. He's our king, right? And he wants to fight the Saracens to the south. He wants God's true church to rule. Seward's words trailed off as he looked at his father's stern face. I'm sorry, he said eventually. No, son, said Gerhard. I'm sorry. Of course you want to be a soldier. The blood of princes runs through you. He stood up, and so did Seward. Gerhard took his son by the shoulders. It's just, I wish it weren't for the Franks. He clapped Seward on the shoulder, and Seward nodded in understanding. They sat back down. Hilka had boiled some water, and now she mixed in some honey and handed it to her stepson. She looked across the hearth at Gerhard and smiled at him sympathetically. He gave a worried smile in return, then stood to take a walk before bed.